Welcome to the new Transatlantic Cable, a tripartite civil engineering history webinar series. The webinars are coordinated by the History and Heritage Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National History Committee of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Panel for Historical Engineering Works of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Today's installment, recorded on February 1st, 2023, features Dr. Nicholas Bill on Transatlantic Bridges, North American Influences on Timber Rail Bridge Designs in the United Kingdom, 1815 to 1870.
Well, welcome to our webinar for the ASCE, ICE, and CSCE. I am Chuck Spinks. I'm chair of the ASCE History and Heritage Committee, and I'm located in Auburn, California. So let's get started. Today's agenda, we're going to start with, of course, an introduction of our speaker and the presentation. We will have question and answer session afterwards. Please use the Zoom Q&A feature at the presentation progresses, and at the end we'll read those and have the speaker, Dr. Nicholas Bill, talk about and answer your questions. And a little background, this has been going on since March of 2022. This is the fifth in the series, and it has been very successful. We've been very pleased with the response we've been getting. And the intent of we call it the new Transatlantic Cable History webinar, of course, is to enhance the interaction between the societies and the members and recognize civil engineering history crosses international boundaries. So each of these topics would involve at least two of the nations represented by these three professional civil engineering societies. I'd like to introduce our speaker. He has a very interesting background. There's Nicholas. He graduated from the University of Melbourne, Australia, with a bachelor's degree, and then spent some time in industry as a structural engineer in the UK and across the Middle East. And some of his projects, Dubai Metro, Arcapita Bank in Bahrain, and Battersea Power Station in London. He got his PhD from the University of Cambridge and focused on the design and construction of 19th century timber railway bridges built across the UK. He started teaching part-time at Oxford at Lady Margaret Hall and St. Peter's College, and then went full-time in 2021 as a senior lecturer at Cardiff University, and is the industrial liaison lead for the Department of Agricultural, Civil, and Environmental Engineering. His research focuses on understanding, repairing, and adapting historic structures. He also published a book on the British military engineers, the role they played in the development of science and engineering. He is a chartered engineer and member of the Institution of Civil Engineers and is currently co-editor of Construction History Journal. And with that, Dr. Bill, you are on.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to everybody for logging into this session, wherever you happen to be. I have to say, I do think this lecture series is a great initiative, and I do hope it continues, fosters sort of further collaborations between our societies. And if nothing else, I hope today's lecture is a reminder that we've always had much to learn from one another. And some of you might be surprised because this lecture may sort of fly against many people's preconceptions regarding the history of technological transfer across the pond, because most people would probably view it as being unidirectional, certainly before the 20th century. But we Brits, we've always been willing to adopt good ideas from abroad, and indeed there's many ideas that we've actually ripped off and called our own over the years. Timber construction represents just such a case, and it's interesting to see certainly the origins of some of these designs against the backdrop of developing structural iron. So there are four main areas which I'd like to focus on in this presentation. I want to begin by discussing some of the early interactions, particularly those who saw military service in North America, as it is highly relevant. Then I want to discuss the role that publications played. And before we get into specific examples, I'm obviously conscious that not everyone will be familiar with what was built in Britain and Ireland. So I'd like to dedicate a slide to the various forms, particularly the homegrown forms. And then obviously finally we'll finish off and we'll look at the specific examples that made their way across the Atlantic with a note about their likely origins. If we begin by looking at early British and North American interactions, it's probably fair to say that things didn't get off to the best start. But regardless, as one would expect, these interactions began well before the advent of the railways. But what's strange is, unlike the situation with Britain and continental Europe, war in many ways actually facilitated many of these important connections. It effectively brought the first group of professional engineers to North America who would return to the UK with new ideas. And these men were the UK's Royal Engineers. Essentially, these were the military engineers of the British Army. And what's interesting is that from 1747, these men were trained at the Royal Military Academy based in Woolwich, in what was the first technical school in the British Empire. They were given intense instruction in mathematics, mechanics, ballistics, hydraulics, etc., by some of the UK's sort of finest mathematicians and scientists. And this started almost a century before civilian engineers took theoretical education seriously. They also received tuition in art and drawing, so they were well placed to study and record new ideas and bring them home, or indeed in other parts of the British Empire. And what's more is these men were actively engaged in civil engineering projects, especially during the 19th century. And just for example, on this slide, both Sir Thomas Hyde Page and John Montresor, who were involved in civil engineering projects in England and Ireland after they returned from the American Revolutionary War. And so from these very early days, the transfer of technology between the UK and North America is actually in both directions. But if we go back to this first date, Royal Engineers were only employed in limited numbers during the American Revolution. But in contrast, the War of 1812 saw many more deployed across North America, especially at the end of the campaign. And not only do we see some notable Royal Engineers such as Sir William Denison, but a number of prominent civil engineers such as Mawson and Vignoles noted, who actually began their careers as infantry officers in the British Army. And some of these names come up time and time again when we look at the development of timber bridges. Now, broadly speaking, from a history of engineering perspective, the War of 1812 had two very profound effects in North America. The first we see was a significant increase in British demand for North American timber. And this was largely due to deforestation of the British Isles and also the impact of the Napoleonic Wars on the supply of our timber, which we typically sourced from the Baltic. And so this instigated numerous experimental programs aimed at establishing the mechanical properties of North American timbers and did much to further the application of mechanics of materials in Britain. And the second major impact on British North America was the significant increase in capital expenditure on defensive projects. And these were largely carried out by the Board of Ordnance and executed by the Royal Engineers. And possibly the largest of these projects was the Rideau Canal, which is something that will be very familiar to our Canadian friends. It was originally aimed at improving communications between what was Upper and Lower Canada. The project was headed up by Lieutenant Colonel By and required the construction of several large timber bridges across both the canal itself and also the Ottawa River. Now, By had been stationed in North America for many years before, and he actually brought back American bridge designs. And this is evidenced by some of the models that he constructed when he was working in the gunpowder mills back in England. And when bridging the Ottawa River, By demonstrated his knowledge of American practices with similar design to the Washington Bridge built in 1796 by Timothy Palmer. I mean, this example here spans 212 feet, formed of 3 parallel trusses 12 feet apart. So it's quite a substantial structure. Further examples of the Royal Engineers copying American designs appear in the likes of Sri Lanka. This concept for this bridge appears in Sir Howard Douglas's treatise on military bridges, and is thought to be a copy of the bridge over the River Portsmouth. Interestingly, Sir William Denison would later cite this as an example to follow whilst he was serving as the governor of New South Wales in Australia. And what's really interesting is the New South Wales would later become known as Timber Bridge State. And what's particularly interesting is that you see huge influence in American long-span trusses across that state, both in road and rail bridges. The Royal Engineers continued to take an active interest in American infrastructure projects, with many embarking on sort of personal tours. And they even acted as observers in the Civil War and crossed both sides of the lines. Now, whilst these men didn't build railway bridges in the UK, they weren't without their influence. And what's interesting is until the 1960s, all the inspecting officers of Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate who had to inspect and improve bridges before lines were opened were exclusively seconded from the Royal Engineers. So these men recorded a lot of detail regarding rail structures as part of their inspection reports. And some of these are quite detailed, such that we get much of our understanding of these bridges, how they performed from their reports. Now, with the end of hostilities, we obviously had the resumption of trade. And with it, you start to see the movement of engineers and other technical tradesmen. And this happened across the border within North America, and it also happened across the Atlantic. And whilst most historians will typically focus on the attempts, especially in the United States, to acquire certain technologies, and indeed some of our previous presenters in this series have focused on these activities, what's less discussed is some of the people who actually left the fledgling United States for various reasons and tried to ply their trade elsewhere. And one interesting example, and one of the earliest examples, was actually Lemuel Cox, who came in between the two wars. He was a carpenter, inventor, and bridge builder, who in 1789 was invited to Derry in London, in Ireland, to construct a bridge over the River Foyle. And you can see from the slide that a model of this bridge still survives in our Science Museum. There are also surviving drawings which were published in Ruddock's book on arch bridges and their builders. What's interesting is that Cox also brought over both the timber and the skilled workmen from America. And this practice would later be replicated in the late 19th century by American steel mills who sent men and prefabricated buildings over to Britain. That's a whole nother conversation. But for those in the UK who are interested in that, look no further than the example of the Bristol Tramway generator building as an example. But before these steel companies in the United States were in the position to do this, they first had to acquire the necessary technology. And so in the very earliest years of the fledgling republic, the United States actively encouraged various methods of acquiring technology, from sponsored visits to almost outright industrial espionage. And one of the series previous presenters, Mike Crimes, highlighted the role of William Strickland in the development of the canals, but his reports also extended to the railways. Some American engineers went specifically just to buy materials and equipment, such as Horatio Allen of the Delaware Hudson Canal Company. Allen would purchase locomotives from John Urquhart Rastrick, and also made the acquaintance of George Stephenson. And both of these British engineers would later go on and build timber bridges. Other American engineers learned methods of rail construction by gaining direct employment under British engineers. And we have some of the many examples you've just listed on this slide, including George Fisher and Hamilton Fulton. For American bridge builders, the rapid developments of iron rail bridges provided an incentive to embark on their own personal tours, whether to gather information or to sell their ideas. And we all know that Ithiel Town visited continental Europe and the UK between about 1829 and 1830. And what's interesting is upon his return, he acknowledged that his original pamphlet that described his designs was quite defective in many ways. Although we don't know exactly what he meant by that or where and when he came to this realization. But it has been speculated that he was heavily influenced by George Smart's original design. So this begs a question as to what is more influential, an obscure patent that someone had forgot about or well-published and promoted designs. Similarly, at the height of the railway mania, we had Irish-born, American-trained engineer Richard Boyce Osborne, who traveled to the UK acting as William Howe's agent. And we know that Osborne presented a model of Howe's bridge to Robert Stephenson, but Stephenson was rather preoccupied with designing his tubes at the time. He did, however, have much more success in his dealings with Charles Backer Vignoles, who was planning the Waterford and Limerick Railway and was keen to cross the River Suir with a record span. Now, although that particular bridge wasn't actually built due to lack of funds, I believe there was a total of 14 iron hoe truss bridges that were erected between Limerick and Tipperary. And these were all designed and fabricated by engineers and contractors from the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. The dissemination of North American bridge technology went much further than simple personal observations and interactions between those who crossed the Atlantic. Printing technology improved dramatically in the 19th century, and so did the quantity and quality of technical manuscripts, from individual treaties to published journals. And the number of the technical publications increased, so did accounts of North American practices, to the point where it would have been practically impossible for any British or Irish engineer to remain entirely ignorant of developments in North America. Initially, these include isolated accounts of individual structures of significance, particularly within travel books, which had grown enormously in popularity. Others include descriptions of buildings and structures published by the likes of British architect Charles Augustus Busby, as we can see from the slide, his account of the much celebrated bridge over the Delaware in Trenton. Although this is credited to the American Theodore Burr, the design of this bridge at Trenton, it sort of embodies the complex exchange of ideas, with its true origins actually lying somewhere in Somerset in the southwest of England. So again, we have this fuzzy period as to where these designs are actually floating around and who's reading what. Comprehensive accounts based upon study tours were soon published, but whereas the likes of William Scarth Mawson's Letters from Nova Scotia, published in 1830, provided just a general account of the colony, you start seeing publications such as Sketch of the Civil Engineering of North America in 1838 by the engineer George Stephenson. Now, this focused specifically on engineering projects and provided detailed descriptions of the drawings, which you can see from these slides. He wrote chapters on both bridge construction and railways, and Stephenson produced the first favorable account of Town's lattice and Long's patented frame bridges. Stevenson's account of Town's patented lattice bridges constructed on the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad actually followed his meeting with their French-trained engineer, Moncure Robinson, who actually provided Stephenson copies of these drawings. So again, it's interesting to speculate where some of these drawings were actually acquired. Soon enough, we get British engineering journals began featuring articles on North American engineering practices. And indeed, the very first article of the Civil Engineer and Architects Journal in 1837 contained a feature on American railroads. And likewise, the Artisan, a similar publication, followed suit. And some of the earliest papers presented at the Institution of Civil Engineers also focused on American railroads. And within these publications, North American engineers were quite keen themselves to publish their own accounts showcasing their expertise, including Robinson's own paper focused on the River James Bridge, Richmond, Virginia, which is illustrated on the slide on the right-hand side. Larger treatises published by John Wheel contain much wider sections, including descriptions and specifications of American timber bridges. In particular, examples of railway making, published in 1843, include some of the best drawings of American timber bridge produced, some of which can be seen on the left-hand side of this slide. He also produced some quite detailed isometric drawings of timber bridges, and I have to say I've not seen those of any kind in any other publication. And what's interesting is Wheel also spent, as with many of his contemporaries, was quite keen to emphasize the financial model on which these timber structures were adopted. So that typically involved lower upfront costs in order to open the railway, or the railroad, as you say over there, earlier, start recuperating money. And that was seen as one of the key drivers of adopting timber. It's sort of continued. We see in 1858, we have the American engineer, technical journalist and publisher Zerah Colburn. He actually moved to England to take up his position as the editor of The Engineer, which was by then Britain's leading weekly technical periodical. Colburn's role provided him with an opportunity to meet many members of the AIC, including Isambard Kingdom Bradell, who produced hundreds of timber bridges. And he himself was later invited to present a paper to the institution, but this was on iron bridges, which you can see on the top of the slide. At the same meeting, we get a chap by the name of James Robert Mose, who was an engineer from Halifax in Nova Scotia, who published a similar account on American timber bridges. And what's interesting is Mose was actually a pupil of William Scarth Mawson on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway. And after a stint as his assistant engineer then on the Waterford and Kilkenny Railway in Ireland, he then returned to North America to work on railroads. And I believe he crossed the border in between the US and Canada as well. His paper in particular includes illustrations of hose truss designs and the first known account of Daniel Craig Callum's inflexible arch truss, which is seen on the bottom. Towards the late 1850s and early 1860s, we start seeing American publications republished in Britain. And in particular, in 1862, we see Haupt's General Theory of Bridge Construction, which was in 1862 was the first version exclusively for the British market. And this featured many diagrams demonstrating American timber bridge design. Now, the original publication was released in 1851. And we know that this was already popular with British engineers because of comments made in inspection reports. And it actually had also become the recommended read-in to the core. So again, this raises a really interesting question, and I'd love to discuss this more about where they were actually sourcing these books before, what sort of network of exchanging of technical information was in place, particularly in published texts. Armed with this knowledge, how did we do things? For those who are interested, that's an example of one of Brunel's famous fan bridges. He built many of them in Devon and Cornwall in particular. What may surprise many people on both sides of the pond is that between 1835 and 1870 alone, there was something like 2,500 timber structures built across British and Irish railways, and they were built across 268 different railways. These railways were originally private companies which raised their own finance and operated independently, but over the course of the 19th century and early 20th century, they were eventually consolidated and ultimately nationalized just after World War I. Now, in terms of application in the UK, and when I say the UK in this context, I also mean Ireland, because they were still part of the Union then. It broadly followed the overall trends of railway construction, which peaked around about 1848. But timber construction continued well into the latter decades of the 19th century, even after 1870. I just got a little bit, for other reasons, decided to cut my period of study off at that point. And it was also used across the geography of the UK, although we do see higher concentrations in typically more rural areas and isolated areas, especially places like Cornwall, Ireland, the north of Scotland, and also mid and North Wales. And what's really important to note is that timber was rarely the most dominant material used on any particular line. And so it was very common to see timber, masonry, and iron bridges all on the same line, built at the same time. So whilst economics was a significant factor, quite often its use had much to do with the conditions of the particular crossing in question. And it's also important to note that the timber wasn't limited to the preference of a few individual engineers. It was used widely across the profession, although some tended to prefer it more than others. Now, in terms of design, as you can see from the examples on this slide, there were a significant number of types and variations which were developed and refined over time. And most of them were quite simple, as you can see from the top left-hand side examples, typically for spans no greater than, say, 20 feet. When it came to larger spans, British engineers tended to demonstrate a clear preference for arch designs, which were either laminated timber or with polygon arches and their various derivations, such as fan structures. Understandably, some of the earliest British designs copied from North America were, in fact, arch bridges, as we can see happening on road bridges first. John Blackmore's bridge over the River Tweed, seen here on the right-hand side, is a perfect example. It's almost an exact copy of the one on the left-hand side. And what's more is it was actually cited by contemporary literary sources as an example for railway engineers to copy. Didn't quite work out that way, but you can see this sort of the precise origins of these laminated timber bridges and where that we see the horizontal laminations across these arches is somewhat contentious. Most will point to continental developments, but it was actually the British who applied them first to railways, and certainly railway bridges. And most followed the design of the father and son team, the John and Benjamin Greens from the north of England, which were expanded upon by Joseph Locke and his partner Errington and his various assistants. And you can see the typical example on the top left-hand side of how a lot of these bridges looked like from a British perspective. And typically what you see in these examples is the deck is placed above a spandrel frame that loads the arch from above. But what we see then is when we look at the example that Vignolles built across the River Lune, you start to see then these North American influences starting to appear. Now, I appreciate the quality is quite poor, but you can quite see the deck here is positioned well below the crown of the arch, and the laminated timber itself is actually integrated in with the truss, which is not all that dissimilar from the sketch of the Pennsylvania Canal Aqueduct seen on the left-hand side, which was published in the UK approximately 6 years earlier. And it's a clear, distinct departure from previous British practices. And given Vignolles' early history in North America, it's most likely that you can see that American influence. In the same year, we had Joseph Cubitt carry the Great Northern Railway across the River Witham at Bardney, and he used this most peculiar design on the right-hand side. Now, unfortunately, the engraving isn't the best, but considering the corresponding inspection report, we can deduce that the arch had been integrated with the truss design in a manner which was quite typical of seen through the United States, as per the example on the bottom left-hand side of the slide. So again, a distinct departure. And there are also inspection reports that suggest that Joseph Locke also experimented with integrated arch and truss bridges in Scotland around about the same time. At Glenary on the Aberdeen Railway, Locke and his partner Errington reportedly erected a 14-span viaduct, each of which contained 60-foot spans formed of laminated timber arches placed on either side of a hoe truss. Now, what's really frustrating is the drawings are in a fragile state, and sadly, the archivists just won't let me see it, and it's not been digitized. So it's just incredibly frustrating. I hope to one day see it and confirm what it actually is, but I suspect it's a similar design to what we see on the right-hand side. There is much clearer evidence of hybrid designs mixing trusses with polygon arches. Here you can see on the right-hand side, we see a hoe truss integrated with polygon arches in what is a very clear copy from America. The one on the right-hand side was built for the Peterborough branch of the Eastern Counties Railway, and it's almost an exact copy of that built on the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, which was then recorded in Haupt's book on bridge construction. Now, this example has been attributed to Robert Sinclair, who had previous dealings with Locke and Errington in Scotland. Sinclair was a locomotive engineer, I believe, so it's unlikely the bridge is actually his, so it probably was one of their assistants. As with laminated bridges, the origins of lattice bridges are similarly contentious, but I think it's fair to say, despite what we discussed earlier on the slides, that their development probably owes more to carpenters and engineers in North America than especially in New England, than perhaps anywhere else. And again, we see those with experience and networks linking with North America who then apply these designs in the UK. These in particular were by William Scarth Mawson, who claimed to have erected dozens of these structures on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway around about 1838. However, I can only find hard evidence of around 4 bridges, typically ranging from about 90 to 160 feet in span. What's interesting is there's several differences to those what we see in New England. In particular, the position of the deck was set approximately 2/3 of the height of the girder from the bottom chord of the truss. There are no roofs. I only know of one example of a roof being used. And so instead of providing a box, the lattice girders were actually stiffened by transverse and longitudinal bracing positioned below the deck. And I should note for these, the examples on the right-hand side, that these intermediate supports that you see in these photos were actually added after the original construction owing to the performance issues. Now, Mawson wasn't the only British engineer to design lattice bridges, and what's more, I can't be certain he was even the first. I recently came across this example on the left-hand side, which has been signed in 1838 by Robert Stevenson and Son, which I strongly suspect refers to David Stevenson, the author of A Sketch of Civil Engineering in North America, which we discussed earlier. Now, I don't think this design was actually built because I have photographs which show a different design that's been used, but nevertheless, it does further demonstrate interest in this type of bridge. And there are probably others which have not yet been identified. Staying in Scotland, we also see Sir John McNeill designing lattice timber bridges, noticeably this one at Carry and Gill on the Wishaw and Coltness Railway. And McNeill experimented with different types of bridges on this mineral line, literally, as he made detailed measurements of deflections of these bridges under locomotive loads. The design of this lattice bridge is similar to those produced by Mawson on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway, with the exception of the additional transverse bracing to the compression cord that you see on the upper right-hand side of this slide. And so whilst this was the only timber bridge that I know that McNeill actually built, it was crucial in his development of the first wrought iron lattice bridges, which were built on the Dublin and Drogheda Railway in his native island. Across the water, we see similar developments. Mawson returns to lattice designs for the Norwood Viaduct on the Waterford and Kilkenny Railway. Some argue that the Irish engineer Robert Mallet actually completed the design, reportedly using timber that was shipped over from Canada. In Ireland, we also see a rare example by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who constructed a 28-foot span overbridge on the Dublin and Wicklow Railway between Drummond and Bray. What's interesting is later in 1851, Brunel actually made a comment during an ICE meeting that much of the material employed in lattice bridges was actually useless, And so he much preferred the arrangement of the Warren girder, which he thought was much more economical. Other prominent engineers, such as Brunel's friend, Robert Stephenson, also made negative comments regarding lattice bridges. But therefore it's surprising that we actually find evidence of several lattice bridges built across Stephenson's railways. And these were probably the works of his assistants, including Robert Benson Dockwray and the Irish engineer William Torrance Doyne. And Doyne would later collaborate with William Bindon Blood in publishing a paper on the calculation of stresses within lattice girders themselves. Finally, we see the adoption of trestle bridges. And what's interesting is despite being sort of widely publicized and indeed championed in contemporary literature, we see a surprisingly small number of these types. So I've only identified a handful. And when I say these types, what I'm typically referring to is these high-level or multi-tiered viaducts, which are typically synonymous with American railroads. In contrast, we see hundreds of simple trestle bridges consisting of gears formed of braced piles, and they were constructed right across the British Isles, especially where the line crossed rivers or boggy ground. However, when it came to crossing rivers or ravines, British and Irish engineers tended to go for structures built off masonry piers, even when timber spans are used. So I can only speculate that the volume of timber required to build these structures just wasn't economically viable for them. Another possible explanation is that some viaducts were built of masonry piers capable of supporting iron spans or even masonry piers, so should they be required to do so. Hopefully hitting time, just wrapping things up. I think probably the takeaway from this is that there is clear exchange of knowledge, which is two ways across the Atlantic. We see numerous engineers from both sides cross, and we see drawings of structures which were either made from observations or exchanged as part of professional networks. And that is something I would really like to explore in a lot more detail. We see significant interest in North American practices within British technical literature, and I mean both developments in both Canada and the US. And there's clear evidence that numerous American designs were copied, and either in their entirety or at least partially, and adapted as British engineers did tend to want to do their own thing. So on that note, I'll just pause for questions, I think, hopefully on time. Points and directions and further reading.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Bill. So very interesting. And since my interest is primarily in early railroad history in the US, which of course draws a lot from the UK and some of the early bridges, this was very interesting since we used lumber out of necessity because of the cost and the time constraint of constructing with stone, which was more common in the UK. So one question, UK did not have a lot of forests themselves, did they? So you had to ship lumber either from Canada or from the continent? Where did the wood come from?
Yes, the preference was, and indeed this is reflected in timber which was imported for the Admiralty, because obviously we were building the world's biggest timber navy at that time as well, was from the Baltic countries. As things in the 19th century progressed, the Canadian market opened up, you do see a lot more timber being shipped over from North America for these bridges. What's really difficult to determine in the UK is just exactly what timber was built, or what timber was used. I mean, by that I mean species, is because some of the drawings and indeed the specifications are incredibly vague. They talk about the quality of timber they want, but they don't necessarily specify the species. Others are very prescriptive. And what's interesting is what you see on some of these lattice bridges, for example, is that, or bridges in general, is you may actually get different types of species specified for different components of the same bridge. So you might get, say, rock elm used for piles, or yellow, the lattices themselves might be, some sort of pine, and then they used a lot of Canadian oak for the top chords. And so, yes, it varies significantly depending on what the engineer wanted. But what's interesting as well is what happens within the UK is that as British understanding of material science and mechanics improves, the technical complexity of these bridges falls away. So by 1870, we are typically designing very simple bridges, simple beam spans, simple strutted beam spans, or what have you. We've moved away typically from those more complex long span trusses or even arch bridges, which is kind of opposite of what happens in somewhere like New South Wales.
There are some questions here. One of them was a comment. There was a lot more empirical design at the time and more failures too. I think I expect a lot was learned through all of the experimentation. And certainly here in the US, the failures were great for learning about bridge design and probably similar elsewhere. Any comments
Yes,
on that?
well, absolutely. Mechanics doesn't really get applied in a significant way in Britain until really about the sort of like the mid 1850s and then on. I mean, you start getting rational design. So when you actually look at what sort of structures were built, it does raise the question early on, what did they actually do? And it was a combination of models and experimentation. And that could be load testing. That all bridges were proof tested. I mean, that the Royal Engineers carried that out. They started that with the loading up of the spans, using both static and rolling loads as well over bridges to test them. And you scale models, or even whether it be half scale or smaller, or sometimes even full scale models of components. And so if anyone's ever read Isambard Kingdom Brunel's notebooks, you just see basic sketches, very little mathematics, and a lot of experimental data that he's ordered from various experiments. And they've pieced that together to form their design. One thing that Britain never really got to grips with complex truss designs was the problem of tension in joints. And what you tended to have was a lot of problems with dynamic instability causing a working of the joints.
Okay, next question.
Lifespan, I think, is a common feature. How long do these bridges last? Well, that depends. I think some lasted a couple of years. Some lasted 12. The economic model demanded they last at least 12. Most succeeded that and exceeded that. What you have to be very mindful of is what actually caused them to fail. And in many respects, I can't find a single example where we've had a catastrophic failure of timber elements on a railway bridge in the UK. And so what typically ended these bridges was, yes, it was a combination of decay. They were regularly inspected. But when you look at when these bridges were built, typically in the more complex ones, this is typically in the 1830s, 1840s, is by the time you get to even 1860, the locomotive loads have doubled. By the time you get to 1900, they've quadrupled. So I don't really know any structure that I've built now that can withstand a fourfold increase in its imposed load. So I think sometimes when we look at the lifespan of them, we have to look at it in the context of what they were actually subjected to. And we also have to think that sometimes they were replaced purely and simply because they were built only with a single line. And when they doubled up the line, then rather than if they couldn't augment the bridge, or rather if they were going to build a second bridge to take the second line, it was just easier to use another material and use that as a sort of a temporary bridge. And that's basically what they did.
Yeah. Here in the US, some of the Howe truss wood bridges lasted 20 to 25 years, but iron was expensive, so it drove the owners of those bridges to extend their use longer. And of course, they were usually covered.
Well, if you go to New South Wales, you'll see similar bridges to which were designed by the likes of Percy Allen, an Australian engineer who was heavily influenced by the States. And you've still got bridges standing, which were built in the late 1800s, and they're still standing today. They can work. Gordon's point, he asks about James Newland's book, The Carpenter and Joiner's Assistant. He said Newlands was a University of Edinburgh graduate and a pioneer in public health engineering in Liverpool. And he said the book went through 5 editions. Is there evidence of its use and readership in the US? I know the book you're referring to, it's probably the best book of timber of that period, and probably the last sort of major treatise on timber before it gets completely relegated. I'm not sure if it made its way over to the US. There are certainly American examples of bridges in that version that were published over here. So perhaps one of our American friends can answer that. But what's interesting about that book is that the drawings in it weren't actually collated by Newlands. They were actually collated by, did have his name, but I've forgotten it now, but it was an architect who actually died. And he did have experience, again, of activities in North America.
In my research of wooden bridges here, I've not seen reference to that book, but there are references.
It's an excellent book.
Yeah. The Howe truss, of course, had wrought iron tension rods. So it was
Yes.
very different from
Yes.
previous wood. It also had the advantage that it didn't require skilled carpenters. So that made it easier building bridge out in the wilderness, and they didn't have to have skilled carpenters to put those together. So
No.
it changed when they developed the hot truss.
If you look at Isambard Kingdom Brunel's work, particularly in his king post trusses, you see some very complex arrangements with combined iron and timber members. And typically what they were trying to do was to, a bit what the Hoe truss does, try to get the tension in the iron and the timber in compression. But they never really came up with an effective way. And of course, when you think about the access to high quality structural iron, once these railways had opened themselves, improved themselves, and they were making revenue, it was just easier to just replace them rather than just revamp them with more complex timber designs. But of course, in places like India or Australia or New Zealand, they were using similarly American and combination of British examples because timber was more plentiful there and iron was very difficult to get.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Thank you. Our next event is scheduled for March 29th. Prince of Wales Fort in the Canadian Conservation of an English White Elephant by Nigel Shrive. And with that, we'll see you then. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for everyone who turned out.
The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals listed here.